Deep within the rugged Ozark Mountains, the forest holds a presence that refuses to be silenced. On nights when the wind dies and the woods grow unnervingly still, a cry erupts, low at first, then splitting the night with an unearthly shriek. Locals whisper of a predator, unlike any other, glowing eyes burning red in the shadows, antlered horns outlined against the moon, and a body so massive it moves like a phantom through the trees. Hunters vanish without trace, their camps torn apart as if by claws the size of blades. The Ozark Howler is no folktale. It is the nightmare that walks these hills. The Ozark Hills carried a silence unlike any other place in the South. It wasn't the peace of untouched wilderness, but the tension of land that seemed to breathe on its own. At dusk, the wind twisted through narrow hollows, bending the trees in strange unison, as if the forest was keeping a rhythm only it could hear. Locals swore the sound was alive, low, mournful, carrying words hidden in its tone. Visitors dismissed it as the wind, but those who stayed long enough began to doubt. Something lived in those hills, and it had a voice. Travelers often spoke of the strange stillness that fell before night. Fully claimed the ridges. Birds cut their songs short, frogs hushed by unseen fear, even the insects retreating into quiet. The silence didn't soothe. It clawed at nerves, heavy and unnatural. Hunters who lingered too long felt watched, though no eyes could be found. More than once, men abandoned their campfires, choosing to flee back to town rather than risk the night. The forest didn't welcome outsiders. It seemed to study them, waiting for the right moment. Campfires cast long, twisted shadows against the trees. But in these hills, shadows behaved differently. They stretched too far, bent at angles that defied the flames. Men watching the fire swore the shadows moved on their own, slithering like animals circling just outside the light. When someone stood to challenge them, the shapes stilled, almost mocking in their silence. By dawn, the ground showed no tracks, only the uneasy memory of being hunted by things unseen. Legends of the howl had haunted the Ozarks for generations, carried in whispered stories around fireplaces and tavern tables. The sound, they said, wasn't just a cry, but a warning. It came from deep in the ridges, echoing through hollows in tones no wolf or panther could produce. Those who heard it described a mix of scream and growl, mournful yet furious, as if grief itself had taken on a voice. No man could listen without feeling the weight of its rage. The hills were a maze of dense oak and pine, their canopies knotting together so tightly that moonlight rarely touched the forest floor. Paths shifted with each season, trails swallowed by vines, streams rerouted by sudden floods. Hunters, who knew the woods like the backs of their hands, sometimes vanished within them, their absence explained away as accidents. But whispers said the hills had claimed them, swallowed whole by something that used the dark to hide. At night, the wind carried more than rustling leaves. People lying awake in cabins on the outskirts claimed to hear heavy steps pacing the tree line. The footsteps came slow, deliberate, like a predator too confident to rush. Dogs whined and pressed themselves into corners, refusing to go outside. Sometimes, in the middle of the pacing, the howl tore through the night, long, drawn out, filled with a sorrow that made the heart ache. Whatever made it wasn't hunting for food alone. Farmers reported livestock vanishing without a trace. Entire pens left open with no blood, no struggle, only silence, and the lingering stench of musk clung to the air. Horses bolted at shadows, dragging plows into fences or refusing to approach the woods entirely. Those brave enough to follow the tracks never found bodies, just prints too large for any mountain lion, too broad for any wolf. They disappeared deep into the ridges, as if the earth itself had erased them. The howl wasn't confined to wilderness alone. It crept closer to human places, echoing across valleys into sleeping towns. People woke in terror, swearing it rattled their windows, even though the forest line was miles away. The sound sank into bones, vibrating through walls, carrying a message no one could translate. Mothers clutched their children, fathers sat with rifles at the ready. Yet no beast ever approached the lights. The sound was enough, it needed no body to terrify. Some men tried to explain it as superstition, claiming the howl was nothing more than wind funneling through caves. Yet those same men grew pale when asked why the caves themselves seemed to breathe, exhaling fog even on warm nights. Explorers reported hearing whispers in the dark, echoes that didn't match their voices. More than one expedition into those caverns ended early, the men stumbling out wide-eyed, unwilling to speak of what they'd heard within. There were stories of hunters firing into the dark, convinced something stalked them beyond the glow of their lanterns. The gunshots echoed far, but no body ever fell, no blood stained the soil. Instead, the howl rose louder, closer, shaking the trees, until leaves rained down like ash. Those hunters never returned to the ridges. When asked, they only muttered about voices that weren't human, voices that called their names from the shadows. One winter, a small party of trappers disappeared after reporting a massive shadow moving between trees at dusk. The search party found their camp torn apart, pelts shredded and scattered, traps crushed as though under impossible weight. There were no bodies, only claw marks gouged into the wood of nearby trees, marks deeper than any bear could carve. The snow carried no tracks leading away, as if the men had been lifted into the air. Cabins left standing for decades, sometimes collapsed overnight, without warning. Locals claimed it wasn't rot or storms, but the hills rejecting those who dared to stay. Travelers who slept inside swore the walls creaked as though pressed from outside, something circling just beyond the lantern light. When they awoke, they found claw marks across the doors, etched too high for any ordinary beast. The cabins were abandoned soon after, left to decay into the soil. Those who heard the howl alone described the strangest effect. The sound seemed to follow them long after it faded, humming faintly in the back of the skull. Some claimed it echoed in their dreams, drawing them back into the woods night after night. Others said it twisted into familiar voices, imitating loved ones who begged them to return. The hills weren't just a place, they were a lure, and the howl was the bait. Hunters told of moments when the forest went still and they felt an overwhelming urge to kneel. They didn't know why, only that it seemed demanded by the presence pressing down on them. Some prayed aloud, others whispered apologies into the trees. Whatever lived in those ridges seemed to feed on submission, bending men's wills without ever showing its form. Few returned to hunt after such moments. Most left their rifles behind, unwilling to ever hear the woods answer back. The Ozarks were filled with hollows where sound traveled strangely, bouncing in ways that disoriented even seasoned explorers. Shouts came back warped, footsteps multiplied, and whispers carried far beyond their source. Some said the land itself conspired with the creature, shaping echoes into illusions. A man could be surrounded without ever seeing movement. The howl thrived in those hollows, turning every echo into part of its chorus. On stormy nights, lightning revealed silhouettes along the ridges, shapes too large to be deer, too tall to be men. They vanished as quickly as the flashes came, leaving hunters and farmers clutching at crosses around their necks. No one wanted to admit what they saw, but all agreed on one thing. The storm always ended with a howl that rolled across the valleys, louder than thunder, echoing until morning. The ground itself seemed to carry memory. In certain hollows, the soil was darker, damp, even in drought. Locals said those were the places where the creature had fed, soaking the land with what it took. No grass grew there, no roots thrived. When the wind cut across those patches, it carried the faint stench of decay. Even animals gave them a wide berth, steering clear as though the ground itself warned them away. Men who survived encounters rarely spoke. Their silence was not born of pride, but fear that words might invite the thing back. One man returned from a hunt with hair turned white, his rifle snapped clean in half. He never set foot in the hills again, choosing instead to move his family far away. When asked what had happened, he only said, "It looked back at me, and it wasn't supposed to." The howl wasn't always distant. At times, it came from just beyond the firelight, close enough that the sound rattled teeth. Men would turn in unison, rifles raised, only to find nothing but dark. The air carried a heat then, thick and oppressive, like standing in front of a furnace. Some swore they saw eyes glowing red in the distance. Others insisted they saw shapes crouched low, but all agreed on the same truth. It wanted them afraid. Stories of the hills spread beyond Arkansas, carried by travelers who had heard too much. They spoke of voices that rose from the ground, of shadows that walked without bodies. Each tale seemed too wild to believe, yet the consistency of the fear was undeniable. People who had never met described the same sound, the same sensation of being hunted by something unseen. The hills had a way of ensuring their story was told. There were times when entire hunting parties returned missing one man. The others couldn't explain what happened, only that he was there one moment and gone the next. They searched, shouted, fired into the dark, but no trace remained. The missing men were always the quiet ones, the ones who walked slightly at the back. It was as though the hills preferred to pluck the forgotten first, one by one, until no one dared return. Some believed the creature wasn't flesh at all, but spirit, born from the land itself. The howl, they argued, was the voice of the Ozarks crying against the blood spilled on its soil. It wasn't hunting, it was vengeance, carried out in a form men could not hope to defeat. That theory did little to comfort those who still had to live within the hills' reach. If it was the land itself, there would never be escape. Even in daylight, the fear lingered. Men found prints in the mud, each one larger than a human chest, the claws gouging inches deep. The prints always led toward the hollows, never out. Dogs refused to follow them, howling at the trail but retreating with tails tucked. No matter how many hunters tracked the prints, they never ended with a sighting. The tracks simply stopped, as though the beast had lifted into the air. Children who grew up in the valleys learned the rules early: never whistle after dark, never wander near the ridges alone, and never answer if you hear your name in the woods. These lessons were passed down with the same seriousness as fire safety or storm warnings. Parents knew the hills demanded respect, and to break those rules was to invite the howl. Stories were not told for entertainment, they were survival. The howl itself changed with the seasons. In summer it carried long and sharp, slicing through the humid air like a blade. In winter, it was deeper, rolling like distant thunder across the frozen valleys. In spring, it rose higher, like the cry of something waking from a long slumber. No matter the season, the effect was the same. Men froze where they stood, hearts pounding, knowing they were not alone in the hills. And so, year after year, the Ozark Howler remained more than a tale. It was a presence that bent the land around it, shaping lives with fear and silence. No man could master it, no hunter could claim it. The hills themselves seemed to bow to it, carrying its voice across valleys, as a reminder that not all predators can be seen, and not all cries belong to the living. The hills howled back, and those who listened never forgot. The first prints appeared just after a heavy rain, when the ground was soft and unyielding. They stretched across the muddy path in a line too wide to belong to any known animal. Each impression was deep, pressed with a weight that seemed far greater than any bear or elk. The edges were sharp, as if claws had carved through the soil rather than paws. Men who studied them muttered nervously, unable to explain why the tracks were so fresh when no creature had been seen. At first glance, the prints seemed ordinary enough. Large, yes, but possible. Yet the longer men followed them, the more unsettling they became. They never meandered like the steps of a wandering beast. Instead, they marched in a straight line, deliberate and unbroken, cutting through streams and over rocks as though nothing could interrupt their path. Hunters grew uneasy, whispering that no wild creature walked with such precision. The strange trail carried on for miles, crossing ridges and valleys without pause. In places where the ground grew steep, the tracks pressed even deeper, as though the creature had only grown heavier. No drag marks followed them, no slips, no breaks. It moved with a steady confidence, ignoring terrain that would have slowed or deterred any known predator. By the time night fell, the hunters realized the trail wasn't wandering, it was leading. When they tried to trace the prints backward, they found no beginning. The first step seemed to appear out of nothing, stamped into mud without approach. There were no signs of entry, no branches broken, no grass bent where it should have passed. It was as though the thing had simply manifested in the middle of the path. The men exchanged looks, fear settling heavier than the rifles on their backs. The size alone defied explanation. Each track was broad enough for two hands laid side by side, the depth suggesting immense strength. Claws gouged into the earth, leaving rakes that cut deeper than any wolf could manage. The pattern was bipedal at times, quadrupedal at others, as though the creature shifted form mid-stride. The men following it began to argue in hushed tones, unsure if they hunted one animal or something far stranger. Rivers offered no refuge from its trail. Where the prints reached the banks, they continued across the water without hesitation. Stones beneath the surface carried gouges, proof the weight had pressed even below the current. When the hunters crossed, soaked to the bone, they found the tracks waiting for them on the opposite side, unbroken, undisturbed. Whatever had left them had no fear of drowning. Villagers who heard of the tracks came to see for themselves, but none stayed long. Even in daylight, the prints radiated unease, as if the ground itself resented being scarred that way. Mothers pulled their children back, muttering prayers under their breath. Old men claimed they recognized the shape from stories, legends of something that had stalked the hills long before settlers carved homes into the wilderness. At night, the tracks seemed to change. By lantern light, their shapes stretched and warped, claws appearing longer, steps appearing closer together. Some swore they shifted entirely, rearranging themselves as though the ground refused to hold their true form. A brave few returned in the morning to check, only to find the prints fresh again, edges sharp as though they had just been made. The path was never the same twice. Dogs refused to approach them. Even the boldest hounds, trained to face bear and cougar, tucked their tails and whined when brought near. Some howled, their cries mournful and urgent, as though warning their masters away. A few broke free entirely, bolting into the woods rather than remain close to the scent. The men didn't need the dogs' fear to know what they felt, the weight of something unnatural pressing down from the hills. As the trail wound deeper into the wilderness, it crossed paths that should have been impassable. Fallen logs showed no marks of climbing or leaping. The tracks simply resumed on the other side, uninterrupted. Rocky cliffs bore prints embedded into stone, shallow but undeniable, as though claws had carved through granite itself. Hunters stared in disbelief, wondering what kind of beast could stride through rock as easily as through soil. The tracks never looped back. They never circled prey, never lingered near water, never strayed from their course. They led forward with a determination that chilled the men who followed them. It was as though the creature wasn't searching for food, but for something else entirely. Some muttered it was heading toward the villages. Others swore it sought a place forgotten. No one dared to voice the possibility that it sought them. The prints led through clearings where the ground was bare, yet still, impossibly, they appeared. Blades of grass bent outward, pressed flat as if beneath invisible weight. In snow, the trail was even clearer, impressions perfectly formed, melting slower than the surrounding drifts. Men leaned down to touch them and recoiled, swearing the snow within the tracks was warm, steaming faintly even in the dead of winter. Sometimes the trail ended abruptly, cut off in the middle of open ground. Hunters stared in disbelief at the final mark, searching the area for any sign of continuation. Then, as if mocking them, the prints began again several yards ahead, resuming their steady path. The gaps grew larger the farther they went, until it seemed the creature was striding through space itself, vanishing and reappearing where it pleased. The farther they followed, the heavier the air grew. Birds refused to sing, the forest falling into unnatural silence. Even the wind seemed to hold back, leaving only the crunch of boots and the dreadful sight of fresh marks ahead. Some men turned back, their courage spent, while others pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and grim curiosity. The forest watched in silence, its shadows thickening with every step. At the edge of a clearing, they found a circle of prints spiraling inward. The formation was precise, unnatural, as though the creature had turned in place deliberately. At the center of the spiral lay nothing. No carcass, no den, no sign of struggle, only soil darker than the rest, damp and rich as though it had been fed. The men didn't speak of what it might mean, only hastened their pace, unwilling to linger. One night, after hours of tracking, they made camp near the path. At dawn, they awoke to find new prints surrounding their tents, circling them in perfect silence. The men's rifles lay untouched, yet the message was clear. Whatever left the trail knew they were following, and it had been watching them in return. No man slept easily after that, and every step forward carried the weight of unseen eyes. Rumors spread quickly, turning the tracks into a tale told by firelight. Some said they belonged to a phantom beast too old and too large for mortal eyes. Others claimed it was the land itself walking, the hills reshaping into flesh and claw. A few whispered it was a punishment, called forth by sins left buried in the soil. Whatever the truth, the tracks grew in legend, even as new ones continued to appear. The strangest detail was always the same. No matter how long the trail stretched, it never ended with a body. There were no dens, no nests, no signs of rest. Just an unending march forward, prints carrying into valleys and across ridges, without conclusion. Men joked nervously that the tracks might circle the earth itself, looping endlessly. But none laughed when they remembered the warmth of the prints, proof the creature was still near. Children dared each other to follow them, but few ever managed more than a dozen steps. Fear always turned them back. Though they rarely admitted it, some said they heard whispers while walking, voices that seemed to rise from the impressions themselves. Others claimed they saw shapes in the distance, watching from just beyond sight. Parents forbade such games, warning their children the tracks were not to be trifled with. The most chilling accounts came from those who swore the prints changed shape as they watched. What began as clawed impressions twisted into hooves, then into bare feet larger than any human. Some even shrank, shifting into the steps of children, though no child could have carved so deeply into the soil. The men who witnessed it refused to speak further, their eyes haunted by something they couldn't unsee. When heavy rains washed the ground clean, the trail always returned. Sometimes in the same place, sometimes miles away, but always sharp and new, as if no weather could erase it completely. Floods scoured valleys, yet the first dry day revealed prints unmarred, their edges too clean for nature's hand. Hunters stopped trying to predict where they'd appear, resigned to the fact that the trail belonged to something outside their understanding. A few brave souls tried to follow the tracks to their ultimate end. None succeeded. Some vanished altogether, their belongings found scattered near the trail. Others returned broken, refusing to speak of what lay beyond. Their silence was worse than any story, for it suggested truths that no man could bear to tell. The tracks themselves carried the same silence, marching endlessly toward nowhere. And so, the legend grew, not of the beast itself, but of the path it left behind. The tracks became a symbol of dread, a reminder that some trails were never meant to be followed. They led hunters away from safety, away from reason, towards something that existed only to be feared. No one knew where the path truly ended, but everyone agreed on one truth: to follow it was to risk never coming back. By the time the last prints vanished into the ridges, the men had no answers. They carried with them only the memory of clawed impressions that refused to be forgotten. The land bore the scars of something too vast to comprehend, and the silence that followed seemed more damning than the tracks themselves. For in the Ozark Hills, some paths do not lead to prey, or shelter, or home. They lead only to nowhere, and to whatever waits there. The timberline loomed like a wall where trees gave way to jagged ridges. In the fading dusk, shadows stretched long, tangled among the pines. Hunters moving through the borderland often paused here, struck by the sensation of being observed. The silence grew heavy, as though the forest itself held its breath. No one could see what watched them, but the weight of unseen eyes pressed down harder with every step forward. Branches creaked against one another in the wind, but it was not enough to explain the unease. The feeling was sharper, more deliberate, like eyes following the smallest movements. Some men swore they glimpsed faint glimmers between the trees, sparks of light where no lanterns burned. They dismissed it as reflection, perhaps starlight caught in dew. But the glow persisted, vanishing only when directly searched for. Travelers moving along the timberline carried torches, yet the light seemed swallowed by the woods. The deeper they peered, the less their fire revealed. Darkness thickened between trunks, forming shapes that seemed to ripple as though alive. In that blackness, pairs of faint glows appeared, eyes too high, too far apart to belong to wolves. They lingered silently, unblinking, until a man turned his head, and then they were gone. The stories were always similar. Someone noticed the glow, pointed it out, and by the time the others looked, nothing remained. But the watcher's fear did not fade with the vanishing. They described this sensation as lingering, as if the gaze had shifted elsewhere, unseen but still fixed upon them. It was not the fear of predators in the brush, but of something patient, intelligent, measuring. Horses balked at the timberline, refusing to step closer no matter how hard their riders pulled. Their ears flicked toward the trees, muscles quivering as if preparing to bolt. Dogs fared no better. They growled low, hackles raised, but their courage faltered when the glow appeared. Instead of barking, they whimpered and retreated, pressing against their masters as though begging to turn back. Animals sensed what men ignored. The forest was not empty. Sometimes the eyes appeared in greater numbers. Hunters swore they counted 5, 6, even 7 pairs at once, gleaming like embers in the brush. Yet no sound of footsteps followed, no snapping branches or rustling leaves. The eyes simply floated in the dark, patient and still. Then, one by one, they blinked out, leaving the watchers frozen in place, wondering if they had been surrounded. The strangest accounts told of the eyes moving without bodies. They glided between trees faster than anything on 4 legs, always reappearing just ahead. When followed, they shifted again, leading men deeper into the timberline as if drawing them in. More than one hunter found himself far from camp, disoriented, with the faint glow waiting just beyond reach. No tracks ever explained what had passed through. Night patrols along the timberline often returned short-handed. Men vanished silently, without cries or struggle. Their comrades later claimed they had seen eyes fixed on the missing soldier moments before he disappeared. Some believed the glow lured its victims away. Others swore it marked those chosen. The disappearances left behind no trace, only silence and companions too shaken to explain what they'd witnessed. The glow wasn't always red or amber. Some described pale white orbs, cold and steady, that seemed to strip warmth from the air. Others saw green glimmers, sharp and narrow, moving like a predator's gaze. Each sighting carried the same terror, though an unshakable sense that the eyes understood far more than any beast should. They didn't hunt like animals. They judged like sentinels. Cabins built near the timberline bore the scars of the eye's presence. Families reported knocking on their walls at night, heavy and rhythmic, as though something enormous tested the strength of the wood. When they dared to peek through shutters, they saw glows suspended in the trees, watching without motion. Some families abandoned their homes entirely, unable to endure the silent vigilance pressing on them each night. The hills whispered that those eyes belonged to the howler itself, a beast more shadow than flesh. If so, it never revealed more than its stare. Some argued it wasn't the creature at all, but spirits tied to the land, harbingers that walked ahead of it. Whatever they were, the result was the same. Men fled, villages emptied, and the timberline grew wider, claimed by silence and dread. Storms only made the eyes stronger. Lightning strikes lit the ridges, and in those blinding flashes, hunters swore they saw figures attached to the glow, tall, hunched forms crouching low, waiting. But the light vanished too quickly, leaving only memory and fear. When thunder rolled, the eyes flared brighter, reflecting power that no storm could quell. Some said the weather itself bent to the watcher's will. Even in daylight, the eyes haunted memory. Men swore they felt them still, heavy on the back of the neck. Farmers working the fields refused to face the timberline for long, claiming the trees seemed to lean closer when stared at. A few even boarded their windows on that side of their homes, unwilling to risk a glimpse of what might be waiting just beyond the tree line. Children were told never to wander near the forest edge after dark. Stories spread of youngsters who ignored the warnings, chasing fireflies until the glow of the eyes mixed with the insect's light. Those children never came home. Parents searched, calling until dawn, but the timberline answered with silence. The only sound that returned was the faint rustle of branches swaying, as though something unseen had been watching the entire time. The eyes carried weight far beyond their glow. Men who encountered them often fell ill days later, feverish and restless, muttering about being followed. Some never recovered, wasting away as though something had drained them. Others recovered but refused to speak, their silence more unsettling than any story. They lived the rest of their lives avoiding the timberline, never daring to let it enter their sight again. Travelers swore the eyes could appear even when they shut their own. Sleep offered no refuge, for dreams filled with twin lights burning through the black. Some woke screaming, others in silence, drenched in sweat. They said the dreams weren't imagination but memory. The eyes had followed them into sleep, proving distance or daylight offered no protection. No one could outpace something that knew where they rested. The glow often vanished when approached, but sometimes it held steady. Hunters who raised rifles in those moments felt their hands tremble uncontrollably. Some couldn't fire at all, their fingers paralyzed by dread. Others who managed to pull the triggers swore their shots passed through empty air, the bullets disappearing into the night without impact. The eyes blinked only once, as if amused, then returned brighter than before. Those who ignored the warnings sometimes paid the price. One party pressed deeper after spotting the glow, determined to uncover its source. Only one man returned, stumbling into town days later, half mad. His hair had turned gray, his eyes hollow, his words fractured. He spoke only of eyes that moved like fire, and a gaze that ate the soul. He never recovered, and the others were never seen again. The timberline grew into a boundary not just of land, but of courage. Men cut trees and built farms up to its edge. But no farther, beyond lay a realm claimed by the Watchers, left untouched out of respect or fear. Even maps left the ridge vague, lines blurred as though cartographers themselves dared not define it. The glow became not just legend, but geography, shaping where men lived and where they dared not tread. Some said the eyes were older than men, older even than the hills themselves. They claimed the forest was their cathedral and the timberline their altar. The glow wasn't a warning, but a reminder. This was not human land. Every sighting carried that truth, whether spoken aloud or not. The hills belonged to something else, and the eyes were its emissaries. Occasionally, the glow appeared in places it never had before. Villagers saw it in barns, in wells, even in mirrors at night. Panic spread quickly, families fleeing their homes, believing the boundary had shifted, but the glow always returned to the timberline in time, retreating as if it only meant to remind the people of its reach. Still, the message was clear. It could cross the border whenever it wished. Legends grew around the idea that the eyes chose who would see them. Not everyone caught the glow, even when standing side by side. Those who did often bore the mark of fear for life, forever altered by the encounter. It wasn't chance, they believed. It was selection. The eyes didn't appear to everyone, only to those it had already decided to claim. The deeper meaning of the Watchers remained a mystery. Were they guardians, predators, or something worse? The hills offered no answers, only silence broken by the occasional gleam between the trees. Hunters, villagers, and wanderers alike came to the same conclusion. It was not the beast itself they feared, but the eyes that marked its presence. And in the timberline, once you saw them, you were never truly free again. The fire crackled softly, throwing sparks into the cold night air. Men huddled close, rubbing their hands, speaking in whispers too low to carry beyond the circle of light. The forest around them stood silent, heavy with shadows pressing in from every side. Though they tried to ignore it, each man felt the weight of something unseen lurking in the trees. The flames were meant to comfort them, yet they seemed fragile, like a shield too thin to hold back what might be waiting. Stories traded across the fire were meant to distract, but no laughter followed them. Every ear strained for sounds in the dark, and every pause grew longer. Someone mentioned the silence that not even the crickets dared to sing. Their words sank heavily into the group, making them realize what they had ignored. The woods themselves were holding back, as though waiting for something to arrive. The fire popped, startling more than one man. The cry came suddenly, ripping through the stillness like a blade through cloth. It was no wolf's howl, no panther's scream, but something deeper, stretched and layered, too large to belong to any natural throat. It rose in pitch until it rattled the air, then broke into a guttural rumble that shook the ground beneath them. The men froze where they sat, wide-eyed, every instinct screaming to run, but their bodies refusing to move. The flames wavered as though struck by a gust, though no wind stirred the trees. Shadows twisted against the trunks, reaching longer, sharper, like claws stretching across the clearing. For a moment, the men swore the fire itself dimmed, smothered by the sound that still echoed in their skulls. Even after it ended, silence did not return. The absence of sound was thicker now, broken only by their ragged breathing. One man tried to laugh it off, insisting it was nothing more than a mountain lion, but his voice cracked, betraying what he refused to admit. Another swore it sounded like a person crying out in pain, though no human lungs could have held that note so long. The argument died quickly, replaced by uneasy stares at the tray line. No one wanted to admit they were waiting for it to return. The fire no longer felt safe. Its glow seemed weaker, the flames smaller, though no wood had been removed. The men tossed in branches, trying to build it higher, but the fire sputtered as if choking. Some swore the cry had stolen the warmth itself, pulling the heat into the woods where it could not reach them. They pressed closer, shoulders touching, rifles resting against their knees. A second cry erupted, closer this time. It split the night like thunder, echoing across the hollow until the earth itself seemed to vibrate. The men covered their ears, but it did nothing to dull the sound. Some wept openly, unable to endure the weight pressing into their skulls. The cry lasted only seconds, but when it ended, the silence felt like punishment, as though the forest demanded tribute for enduring the sound. Eyes darted toward the shadows, searching desperately for movement. Every tree seemed to lean inward, every branch shaped like twisted limbs. The men argued in whispers about whether to extinguish the fire, hide themselves in darkness, but none dared put out the flames. They feared the night itself would collapse upon them if they did. The fire, though weak, was the only barrier between them and the abyss. The ground felt alive beneath their boots, vibrating faintly long after the sound faded. One soldier pressed his palm to the soil and yanked it back with a shudder. He swore he felt a pulse, slow and deliberate, like a heartbeat thrumming deep beneath the earth. No one wanted to test it themselves. They simply shifted uneasily, staring down at the dirt as though it might split open at any moment. The cry returned again, drawn out longer than before. This time it twisted midway, warping into a shrill pitch that clawed at their eardrums. Some dropped their rifles to clutch their heads, screaming for it to stop. Sparks leapt wildly from the fire, scattering across the ground like burning insects. The forest groaned with the echo, branches swaying though the air remained still. The men no longer doubted something inhuman was stalking them. A silence heavier than stone followed, but none dared speak. Their breaths came short, fogging in the cold night air, though the temperature had not dropped. One man whispered a prayer, his lips trembling. Another clutched a rosary so tightly it cut into his palm. Faith felt useless against what prowled beyond the trees, yet they clung to it as their only lifeline. The fire hissed as though mocking their efforts. The men debated fleeing, but fear anchored them in place. To step into the shadows was to accept the gaze of whatever had cried out. The clearing was no sanctuary, but it was familiar, and the woods beyond offered only uncertainty. They argued in whispers, voices rising too loud for their liking, as though afraid the sound alone might summon the cry again. No decision came. Suddenly, a branch cracked just beyond the firelight. All eyes snapped toward it, rifles raised, but nothing emerged. The shadows seemed thicker there, denser, moving faintly as though something enormous shifted among the trees. They waited for another cry, but none came. The silence pressed harder, suffocating, until they longed for the sound again, if only to break the tension. The men realized then that the cry was more than a noise. It was a warning. It froze them not by accident, but by intent, stripping away their will to act. Each repetition carved deeper into their courage, hollowing them out until they were prey too frightened to run. They whispered about leaving at dawn, but deep down they wondered if dawn would ever come. The night already felt endless. As hours dragged by, the cry returned again and again. Each time it came from a different direction, circling the clearing like a predator stalking its prey. North, then west, then from directly behind them. No matter where they turned, it always felt closer. They fired into the dark more than once, muzzle flashes lighting the woods, but their bullets vanished into silence. Not even an echo of impact returned. One man collapsed in panic, crawling away from the fire, insisting the sound was calling his name. His companions dragged him back, but his eyes were wild, glassy, fixed on something none of the others could see. He whispered to the shadows, pleading softly, as though bargaining with the voice itself. The others kept their distance, terrified of what might happen if he listened too closely. The fire shrank as the night deepened, no matter how much wood was thrown into it. Some said the cry had stolen the flame's strength, feeding on the heat as it fed on their fear. The glow barely reached the edges of the clearing now, leaving the men huddled in a small bubble of light surrounded by an ocean of dark. Each new cry shattered what little strength they had left. When the cry finally ceased, the silence did not soothe them. It was worse than the sound itself, a void that gnawed at their sanity. Every man strained to hear what might come next, their ears aching from the effort. But nothing came. No rustle, no footstep, Not even the whisper of wind. The forest had gone dead, and they were trapped inside its corpse. The hours stretched, each one an eternity. The fire dwindled, their nerves frayed, and still they waited for the sound. Some began to nod off in exhaustion, only to jolt awake at the memory of the cry. Sleep offered no safety. They feared what might come while their eyes were closed. They sat wide-eyed, clutching their rifles, knowing they could not outlast the night. Then, without warning, the cry tore through the clearing one final time. Louder than before, it shattered the night like glass, a scream laced with fury and hunger. The men fell to their knees, ears ringing, unable to stand. The fire guttered low, sparks scattering across the ground before dying entirely. They were left in darkness, the cry echoing inside their skulls long after the sound had ended. Panic broke them. Men fled in every direction, rifles forgotten, boots hammering the earth. Some stumbled into trees, others into each other, but none cared. The cry had stripped away reason. It had done what it was meant to do: scatter them, drive them into the jaws of whatever waited. The clearing stood empty, save for the dying glow of embers fading into black. The woods swallowed the men quickly. Their shouts carried through the trees, fractured and desperate, until they were cut short one by one. Silence reclaimed the forest with brutal swiftness. Only the echoes of the cry lingered, faint but unending, replaying in the minds of those who had heard it. The fire pit lay cold, a circle of ash marked by fear. By dawn, no camp remained. Only footprints scattered in every direction told the story of what had happened. Some ended abruptly, vanishing mid-stride as though the ground itself had claimed them. Others led deep into the timberline, swallowed by the brush without return. The clearing itself bore no sign of struggle, only silence, heavy and deliberate. The cry had taken what it wanted. Those who survived spoke little of the night. Their faces grew pale at any mention of the howl, their eyes distant as though reliving it. Some swore the sound still followed them, echoing in the quiet corners of their lives. Others moved away entirely, abandoning the hills that carried the memory. But none ever lit a campfire near the timberline again. And so the legend spread, not of the creature itself, but of its voice. A cry that froze men where they stood, shattered courage and scattered them like leaves in a storm. The firelight had failed them, and in the darkness they learned the truth. The sound was more dangerous than the beast, for it stole their will long before it claimed their lives. The pines towered above the valley like silent sentinels, their dark silhouettes rising against the fading sky. Each needle caught the wind, rustling faintly, but instead of soothing, the sound carried unease. It was as though the trees whispered in tongues too old for men to understand. Travelers paused often along the path, glancing upward, convinced the pines themselves bent closer to listen. No one walked there without sensing a burden pressing down. At dusk, the forest seemed alive in ways no man could explain. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, weaving themselves into the trunks, binding light in patterns too deliberate to be chance. When firelight touched the bark, it flickered in ways that resembled faces, grim, twisted, watching. Men looked away quickly, fearing to confirm what their eyes already told them. The forest was no bystander. It held memory, and it remembered them. Hunters spoke of hearing footsteps that matched their own, trailing just a beat behind. When they stopped, the sound stopped too. When they moved again, the echo returned, heavy and patient, as if something followed without care for stealth. They turned back often, rifles raised, but nothing stirred in sight. The pines swayed innocently in the breeze, but no man could be convinced they were alone. The scent of resin thickened at night, cloying and bitter, unlike the sweet fragrance of ordinary pine. Some described it as sharp as blood, filling lungs with a metallic sting that refused to leave. Men spat to clear their throats, but the taste clung stubbornly. It became impossible to separate the forest from the body. The air itself was tainted, binding fear as tightly as the needles clung to their branches. Whispers carried unnaturally well in those woods. A murmur spoken low among companions stretched far, bouncing from trunk to trunk until it sounded like strangers repeating their words. Men stopped speaking altogether, unwilling to hear their own fears echoed back from the dark. Silence became their only companion, though even silence seemed treacherous, for in it they heard breathing that wasn't their own. The trees themselves bore scars, deep gouges clawed into bark higher than any bear could reach. Some were fresh, sap still dripping down the wounds, glistening like tears in the torchlight. Others were older, etched so long ago that the forest had grown around them, sealing the wounds but never healing them. Each mark was proof that something immense passed through, leaving warnings carved into the very spine of the woods. Paths that once seemed familiar shifted without warning. Trails bent into circles, leading men back to their own tracks, even when they swore they walked straight. Pines stood like sentries, unmoving yet somehow repositioned, herding them deeper into the labyrinth. The longer they walked, the more the forest seemed alive with intent, weaving fear not through imagination but through deliberate design. At times, the trees groaned as if under immense weight. Branches snapped not in storms but in stillness, echoing like bones breaking in the distance. The sound carried low, mournful, unsettlingly human in tone. Men paused, listening harder, but the noise always ceased just before it revealed itself. They pressed forward faster, desperate to escape, yet the groans followed like voices mocking them from behind. The ground beneath the pines grew soft in strange patches, sinking beneath boots though rain had not fallen in weeks. Men swore it felt like stepping on skin stretched over hollow earth. Each step pressed air through unseen cracks, carrying with it whispers and the faint stench of rot. Some dared to prod with their rifles, but the soil always closed quickly, erasing signs of what had stirred beneath. Even the animals avoided the place. No deer wandered there, no birds sang among the branches. Only owls lingered at the edges, watching silently with eyes too wide and unblinking. Their calls were absent, replaced by stillness that felt rehearsed. The absence of life left the forest heavier, a cage without sound, where the only heartbeats were human and too fast to remain unnoticed. Travelers spoke of lights glimmering between the trunks, pale and fleeting, never steady. At first mistaken for lanterns, they revealed themselves as something stranger. They darted upward, too high for any man to carry, or drifted slowly, as though floating through the air. Those who tried to chase them never returned, their companions finding only boots or torn fabric snagged on bark. The lights lured men like moths to flame, weaving doom into wonder. Some swore the pines themselves whispered names. Voices rose in the rustling, bending into syllables too clear to dismiss as wind. At first men laughed, brushing it off as coincidence. But when the whispers repeated, stronger and unmistakable, laughter died. The forest called each man individually, syllables stretched and distorted, beckoning him deeper into its heart. Few resisted the urge to step forward. The air thickened the farther men pressed into the grove. Breaths came harder, chests heavy as though invisible hands pressed down upon them. Some stumbled, coughing violently, swearing the trees exhaled dust that scalded their lungs. Lanterns dimmed inexplicably, their flames shrinking to fragile glows despite full oil. In that choking darkness, fear was no longer imagined. It was inhaled, tasted, lit. Pines at the heart of the forest grew twisted, their trunks bending into arches that resembled doorways. No man wanted to step beneath them, though some claimed they could hear faint cries carried from the other side. The branches formed shapes too deliberate to be natural, weaving into patterns that resembled cages. They loomed like gateways into another place, daring anyone brave or foolish enough to enter. At night, some trees seemed to move, not swaying in wind, but inching closer, their positions different when men turned back. They stood shoulder to shoulder, tightening the forest into a funnel, forcing paths narrower with each step. Those who noticed too late found themselves surrounded, every trunk pressing closer, needles whispering like countless voices. Escape came only by running blind, though even then, the feeling of pursuit lingered. Campfires built beneath the pines rarely lasted. Flames sputtered quickly, devoured by dampness that hadn't existed moments before. Smoke clung low, pressing into eyes, burning until men could barely see their own hands. Some claimed the smoke formed shapes, faces twisting upward, jaws stretched wide in silent screams. They fled those camps in terror, leaving fires behind, certain they had angered whatever the forest sheltered. Sometimes, the fear itself seemed to weave into dreams. Men fell asleep against trunks, only to wake with scratches across their arms and legs, as though branches had dragged claws across their skin. Others swore they dreamed of endless forests, walking for hours only to find the same tree repeated over and over, marked by their own initials carved long ago. Sleep brought no relief, it only tightened the pine's grip. Those who resisted the pull of dread often suffered worse. They mocked the whispers, cut into the bark, or dared the shadows to reveal themselves. By morning, their courage always withered. Some vanished in the night, leaving only shredded packs behind. Others awoke pale and trembling, muttering incoherently about eyes that opened in the trees themselves. Their mockery was punished, their voices swallowed by the woods. Legends grew that the forest had been woven from fear itself. Every cry, every death, every ounce of terror bled into the roots, feeding the pines until they grew twisted and tall. The trees drank what men tried to bury: panic, sorrow, despair, and returned it in whispers. The more people feared, the stronger the forest became. By that logic, no man could ever conquer it, for simply entering gave it strength. Old hunters said the pines were never meant to be cut. Axes, swung there, dulled quickly, edges chipping as though biting into stone rather than wood. Logs dragged from the forest never burned right, smoldering without heat, filling cabins with acrid smoke that choked those inside. Families abandoned lumber quickly, returning it to the grove in fear of curses. The pines refused to serve men. The deeper into the forest men walked, the more the trees aligned into unnatural patterns. Some stood in perfect circles, others in spirals, as though planted by deliberate hands. The formations unsettled even the most rational minds, suggesting purpose where there should be none. Each arrangement carried weight, like sacred sites built by forgotten people, though no history book ever mentioned such things. The forest itself was its own architect. Those who lingered longest often returned changed. Their eyes seemed distant, their words clipped, their hands trembling even when at rest. They spoke less of what they saw and more of what they felt, watched, measured, and judged by something that lived in the roots. None could articulate it fully, yet all carried the same haunted look, as though fear had been woven into them just as it was into the trees. The forest gave no closure, no final answer to its secrets. Each man who entered left with more questions than before. If he left at all, some trails vanished forever, leading only to silence. Others returned men broken, half mad, muttering about voices in the wood. And still, the pines remained, tall and unmoving. Guardians of something too vast to name, fear clung to them as tightly as their needles clung to branches. The forest needed no beast to terrify. It was enough that the trees themselves stood as living monuments to dread. Their silence was not peace, but judgment. Their shadows not shelter, but threat. Men avoided them when they could, but the memory lingered. Fear was woven into the pines, and once a man breathed it in, it never truly left him. The hollow sat low between two ridges, a basin where light never lingered. Even at noon, the sun barely pierced the canopy, leaving the place in perpetual dusk. Hunters avoided it when they could, for its air felt heavy and wrong, like stepping into another world. Yet game often fled into its depths, drawing men who had no choice but to follow. Those who entered rarely returned unchanged. The path into the hollow was always narrower than men remembered. Trails that seemed wide on maps twisted into tight corridors, forcing hunters to move single file. The trees leaned inward, branches laced together overhead, sealing out the sky. Some men swore the forest itself was guiding them, herding them like prey. Every step downward carried the weight of inevitability, a descent not just into land, but into something unseen. Sound changed once inside. Footsteps echoed strangely, louder than they should, while voices came back warped and unfamiliar. Hunters called to one another, only to hear their own names whispered back from the dark. The effect rattled even the bravest, for no echo should have sounded so alive. The hollow swallowed certainty, leaving only doubt and unease. Game tracks led deep into the basin, promising easy prey. Deer prints vanished suddenly, as though lifted away mid-stride. Rabbits left trails that ended in bare patches of soil, no exit to be found. Even blood from wounded animals seemed to fade, soaking into the earth until no trace remained. The hollow devoured more than sound. It erased proof of life entirely. Camps set in the hollow never lasted long. Men awoke to find supplies scattered, traps crushed, and embers smothered. Nothing was stolen, yet everything bore marks of disturbance. Rifles leaned against trees were found meters away, snapped as though bent by impossible strength. When asked what force had done it, no one could answer. They simply left at dawn, shaken and pale. The ground was treacherous, riddled with sinkholes, hidden by pine needles. Hunters stepped forward confidently, only to vanish waist-deep, swallowed by earth that closed around them like a mouth. Companions pulled them free, but the soil clung greedily, dragging boots away. Those who escaped bore scratches along their legs, raw and stinging, as though something beneath had clawed at them. The hollow seemed eager to claim what it could. The deeper men pressed, the more time twisted. Watches ticked erratically, hands skipping or slowing without reason. Some claimed hours passed in minutes. Others swore a short walk lasted an entire day. By the time they emerged, the sun stood at odds with their memory. The hollow bent more than space. It bent the very rhythm of the world. Voices often drifted through the trees, soft and beckoning. At first they sounded like companions calling from ahead, urging the group forward. But the hunters soon realized the voices didn't match anyone in their party. They carried tones too familiar, sometimes echoing wives, children, or long-dead fathers. Few resisted the pull, stepping away from the group to chase what they longed to hear. Those who strayed never came back. Weapons felt useless in that place. Bullets fired into the hollow vanished, into silence. The report muffled as though the air itself absorbed it. Arrows bent mid-flight, snapping against trunks with no force. Men gripped their knives tighter, but even steel seemed duller under the weight of the basin. They were hunters by name only. In that valley they were prey without teeth. On rare occasions, survivors stumbled out days later, eyes glazed, clothes torn. They spoke little, answering questions with fragmented murmurs. One repeated the same phrase endlessly. It walks behind the trees. Another could only sob when asked about his companions, clutching at his chest as though words alone would summon what haunted him. Their silence told more than their words ever could. The hollow bore scars no one could explain. Trees bent outward in strange arches, forming shapes that resembled cages or gates. Stones bore deep grooves, not carved by tools but etched as if dragged by claws larger than a man's hand. In the soil, depressions lingered, shallow, wide, too vast to be paw prints. They were impressions of something heavier, something that moved without care for being followed. At night, the hollow revealed its worst. Fires refused to burn properly, sputtering no matter how much wood was added. Shadows moved differently there, lagging behind their owners, stretching unnaturally long across the ground. Men swore they saw shapes pass between the flames and the trees, blocking light though nothing stood there. The fire gave no comfort, it only deepened the dread. The cries began softly, like wind slipping through cracks. They rose gradually into shrieks that clawed at ears, louder than any owl, sharper than any coyote. Some men dropped to their knees, covering their heads, insisting the sound came from inside their skulls. Others fired blindly, desperate to silence what could not be silenced. When the echoes finally died, the forest fell too still, as though holding its breath for what came next. No bones were ever found. Men vanished with such finality that not even scraps of clothing remained. Search parties combed the basin, finding only broken branches and patches of disturbed soil. It was as though the hollow had swallowed them whole, digesting every trace. Families who lost fathers and sons could only mourn at the edge of the ridge, unwilling to enter the place themselves. Legends grew that the hollow was not natural at all. Some said it was a grave dug by the earth itself, a pit where the land feasted on the living. Others believed it was cursed ground, marked by blood spilled generations ago, destined to pull more into its depths. No explanation comforted those who had seen the fear in the survivors' eyes. Whatever the cause, the hollow demanded tribute. Maps of the area grew vague around the basin. Cartographers left it blank or shaded, unwilling to define its borders. Hunters drew crude circles on their charts with words like beware and keep out. Even locals stopped giving directions that led near it, pretending the place didn't exist. Erasing it from their mouths was easier than admitting it had already claimed too much. The hollow wasn't always still. Some nights, villagers on the ridge swore they saw movement in the trees below, shapes too large to be deer, too smooth to be human, drifting between trunks. Their lanterns revealed nothing when carried closer, yet the air carried a stench of musk and damp fur. Whatever prowled there preferred shadows to light, but its presence could not be denied. Children dared each other to step inside the basin, but few lasted more than moments. The air grew heavier instantly, as though the forest pressed down on their shoulders. Some returned pale and trembling, unable to speak of what they felt. Others walked deeper, laughing nervously, until their voices cut off mid-sentence. When the others ran to find them, no footprints remained. The hollow accepted its prize quickly. Strangest of all were the stories of men who swore they watched their companions vanish in front of their eyes. One moment they stood together, rifles at the ready. The next, the space beside them was empty, the ground undisturbed, no sound of departure. Panic always followed, scattering the remaining hunters into the trees. Each swore they would never return, and none ever did. The basin seemed to breathe at times. Mist rose from the ground in steady rhythm, drifting like smoke from a hidden fire. Hunters stepping into it felt the vapor curl around their legs, tugging gently as though drawing them downward. The mist carried whispers that no one could make sense of, but all agreed the voices were not human. To breathe it was to taste dread itself. The further one descended, the more the forest changed. Pines grew twisted, their roots exposed and gnarled like clutching fingers. Water pooled in places where no spring flowed, dark and stagnant, reflecting shapes that did not exist above. Some claimed they saw their own faces staring back, twisted into grimaces of fear, before ripples broke the illusion. The hollow reflected more than light. It reflected truths men weren't meant to face. Those who knew of the place gave it wide berth, but not all could resist its pull. Some hunters felt compelled to enter, drawn by game that always seemed to flee there, or by curiosity too strong to resist. They carried charms, prayers, and weapons, believing themselves prepared, yet none of those protections mattered. The hollow didn't fight them, it simply claimed them, patient as the earth itself. Over time, the hollow grew into a boundary. It was not marked by fences or walls, but by memory and fear. Men told their sons and grandsons to never step past its ridge. They spoke of it not as a possibility, but as certainty. To enter was to vanish. Stories became warnings, and warnings became laws. Still, every generation lost someone who thought himself braver than the last. The place became legend, not because of what was seen, but because of what was not. No bodies, no trails, no proof. Only the hollow itself remained, a wound in the land that refused to heal. The fear of it wove through the people like roots through soil, binding them in silence. And deep within its depths, the earth waited for the next step forward, the next hunter bold enough to be swallowed whole. They said it was never truly seen, only felt, a presence that clung to the edge of vision, slipping just beyond the corner of the eye. Men walking the ridges swore they heard footsteps pacing them, heavy and deliberate, but whenever they turned, nothing stood there. The silence that followed was worse than any noise, for it confirmed what they already feared. Something stalked them with patience. The beast's legends stretched back centuries, woven into the stories of settlers and natives alike. Descriptions never agreed, yet all carried a common thread. Its size was immense, its outlines shifting, its eyes burning with unnatural fire. Some said horns curled from its skull. Others spoke of a hulking shape cloaked in darkness. No matter the details, everyone agreed it moved with intelligence, and it never hunted at random. At night, the hills belonged to it. Travelers who dared cross after sundown described the uncanny sensation of being herded, steered along paths not of their choosing. The trees seemed to close behind them, shadows pressing tight, while a low growl followed at their backs. No attack ever came, not immediately. Instead, it toyed with its prey, wearing them down until terror itself did most of the work. The air grew colder when it drew near. Fires sputtered, lanterns flickered, and the warmth fled as though swallowed by unseen jaws. Men huddled together, praying silently, but the beast thrived on fear. Each shiver, each whispered plea, fed into its looming presence. Some swore it grew taller, the more frightened they became, stretching above the treetops, blotting out stars with its mass. Its howl was not merely sound but force. It split the night like a blade, cutting through the marrow of those who heard it. The cry seemed layered, carrying voices within voices, as if countless throats screamed in unison. Ears bled, minds fractured, courage shattered, and when silence returned, it was never the same. The men who survived carried the sound with them, echoing in their skulls until their dying days. Few ever caught a glimpse, and those who did rarely described it the same. Some saw a wolf-like beast, massive and hunched. Others spoke of a panther's body twisted with features no animal should bear. A handful swore they saw a man's outline, cloaked in fur with glowing eyes that pierced through the dark. The uncertainty only deepened the fear. It could be anything, and perhaps it was everything. The forest seemed complicit in its hunting. Trees bent in unnatural ways, branches snapping to block escape. Trails looped back into themselves, trapping men in endless circles. The creature didn't need to chase. It let the land do the work, cornering its prey until exhaustion and terror delivered them. By the time the shadow moved in, resistance was gone. The kill was clean, silent, final. Animals knew its presence before men did. Dogs whined and cowered, refusing to track when its scent lay heavy in the air. Horses bolted, dragging wagons into ditches, their eyes rolling with wild terror. Livestock grew restless, bleeding through the night until the sound of claws silenced them forever. The creature left no waste, no remains. What it took, it devoured completely. Survivors described the feeling of being marked. Once the creature chose its quarry, nothing could shake it. It moved unseen, yet its gaze pressed harder with each passing hour. Men tried everything, crossing rivers, climbing ridges, even abandoning their gear to move faster. None of it mattered. The shadow followed, tireless, as though distance itself bent to its will. The few who returned carried scars deeper than flesh. Their words fractured, their eyes darted at every sound. Some never spoke again, their minds broken by nights of pursuit. Others muttered endlessly about glowing eyes and a breath so hot it seared their backs as they fled. One man clawed at his skin until he bled, insisting the shadow had seeped into him and would never let go. Legends claimed the beast was older than the hills themselves. Born from the land, it carried the rage of centuries, a spirit of vengeance bound to the soil. Each victim was a sacrifice, each cry a hymn to its unending hunger. No weapon could pierce it, no trap ensnare it. Men fought, bled, prayed, but the shadow endured. It was not a creature to be slain, it was one to be endured or escaped if fortune allowed. The creature's shadow was sometimes visible even when its body was not. Lantern light cast shapes that stretched unnaturally across the ground, enormous and shifting, with claws and horns far larger than any living form could possess. Men stared in horror as their own shadows bent to meet it, swallowed whole by the darkness until they seemed erased from existence. Some swore their bodies grew cold in those moments, as though part of them had already been claimed. Hunters who entered the woods armed with steel and courage rarely lasted long. The creature thrived on arrogance, stalking those who believed themselves immune to fear. Their camps were found abandoned, rifles broken, fire pits cold. Sometimes the only sign left behind was blood smeared on bark, too high for any man to reach. The forest swallowed their names, leaving only silence where their boasts had once rung. The most chilling encounters came from groups, not individuals. Entire hunting parties vanished in a single night, their camps torn to pieces. Those who found the remains described the ground as soaked, the trees clawed, and the fire reduced to ash. No bodies lay among the ruin. It was as if the earth itself had opened, swallowing every man whole while leaving behind only the marks of their terror. Sometimes the shadow did not kill immediately. It followed men for days, weeks even, letting exhaustion rot them from within. Their eyes grew sunken, their words cracked, their steps slow. Companions begged them to rest, but the hunted always refused, knowing rest meant death. And when they finally collapsed, the shadow took them swiftly, merciful only in its speed. Whispers spread that the creature was not flesh at all, but spirit bound to the wilderness. Some claimed it was the soul of every man lost in the hills, fused into one eternal hunter. Others believed it was a demon, summoned long ago and never dismissed. But no theory mattered to those who felt its gaze. Myth or monster, it killed just the same. Villagers built their homes far from the ridges, not out of superstition but survival. They knew the shadow lingered where the pines grew thick and the hollows deep. Stories became warnings for children. Never whistle at night, never follow the sound of your name, never stray from the fire. Rules passed down like scripture, their truth unquestioned, their origin buried in blood. Even so, the beast refused to stay forgotten. Its shadow stretched into fields, pastures, and towns when the hills grew restless. Men working late swore they saw it slip across barns, sliding along rooftops before vanishing into the dark. The sight left them shaken. Their tools dropped. Their families urged indoors. The creature didn't need to strike. It only needed to remind them it was near. The sound of its breathing haunted the night. Low, guttural, steady. It rattled leaves and stirred dust. It was the breath of something massive, something alive yet too close for comfort. Hunters huddled together swore they felt it brush the back of their necks, hot and damp, though nothing stood behind them. The breath was enough to drive some mad, clawing at the air as if to swat away invisible jaws. Maps marked with its legend were littered with strange gaps, places deliberately left blank. Men knew better than to step into those stretches of forest. But pride often drew them anyway. None came back with trophies. Instead, their names were added to the long list of those the shadow had claimed. Each disappearance strengthened the story, proving that the legend was not merely tale but truth. On rare occasions, the creature revealed more than eyes and breath. Shapes too large to be explained emerged from the tree line, hulking and hunched, moving with impossible speed. They left no prints, no tracks, no proof. Witnesses swore the shadows themselves swallowed what little evidence remained. By dawn, the forest stood clean, as though the night had rewritten itself to erase the memory. One night, a survivor staggered into a village, his clothes torn, his skin blistered. He gasped of horns scraping the sky and claws that could rend stone. His words broke into sobs before he collapsed, dead from exhaustion and fear. The villagers buried him quickly, never speaking of his testimony. They already knew the truth. Some shadows were too real to deny. Generations passed, but the shadow remained. It grew no weaker, its hunger no less. The hills carried its presence forward, weaving it into the land itself. Even when no one saw it, they felt it in the silence, the cold, the lingering dread. It didn't need to strike every night. It only needed to remind them that it could. And so the legend endured. Not as story, but as warning. The creature remained in the ridges, pacing unseen. A phantom with claws sharp enough to shred history itself. Men no longer asked if it was real. They only asked how long until it chose them. For in the Ozarks, the shadow was eternal, and it never walked alone. The Ozark Howler story lingers not just in the forests, but in the hearts of those who dare to listen. From shattered campsites to blood-chilling cries, its legend refuses to fade, reminding us that the wilderness still holds mysteries beyond our control. Whether it is beast, spirit, or something caught between, one truth remains. Fear has deep roots in these hills. So when the woods grow too quiet and the shadows seem to watch, remember, not every hunter returns, and not every scream finds an answer. The Ozark Howler is out there waiting.